I didn't consider myself a belligerent. On the contrary, an observer and a correspondent. I'm awfully sorry, by the way, gentlemen, if there are any newspaper people here. If they'll stay out of my racket, I'll stay out of theirs.
He was Hollywood's golden rogue, branded a seducer, a drunk, even a Nazi spy. For decades, Errol Flynn's reputation was a battlefield of scandal and myth. His films dazzling, while his private life unraveled in gossip columns and courtrooms. Through it all, his widow Patrice Wymore kept silent until now. At 85, she finally spoke, and what she confirmed wasn't what the tabloids wanted. Were his sins exaggerated by the studios themselves? Was his politics misunderstood? And what secret could have changed history if it had come to light? Studio-made sinner. Before Hollywood turned him into a myth, Errol Flynn was just a restless boy from Tasmania with too much charm and too little discipline. Expelled from schools, chased by scandal, and obsessed with adventure, he was the kind of young man parents warned their daughters about, and the kind studios realized they could sell. By the time Warner Brothers found him, he had already lied, cheated, and stumbled his way into odd jobs across Australia and New Guinea. But nothing in that past predicted the overnight transformation that would follow. Flynn's big break came almost by accident. In 1935, Warner Brothers needed a lead for Captain Blood. Their first choices, Clark Gable, James Cagney, even Ronald Colman, had all passed. At the last minute, a virtually unknown actor, tall, dark, and brimming with reckless confidence, was thrust into the role. Flynn wasn't just cast in a film, he was cast in a persona. The studio didn't want audiences to see a nervous newcomer. They wanted a real swashbuckler, a man who blurred the line between actor and character. So, they rewrote his history. Press releases didn't mention his Tasmanian birth or his failed stints at half a dozen schools. Instead, they called him Irish, romanticizing his roots to make him feel more in tune with the roguish characters he played. Warner Brothers declared he was a natural-born adventurer, someone who, if born in another century, might have been a pirate. They knew the public wanted larger-than-life figures, and they were ready to manufacture one. And it worked. Captain Blood was a box office success, but more importantly, it created a new archetype, the real-life daredevil hero. Studio publicity machines tied Flynn's name to his characters so tightly that audiences couldn't separate them. If he played a pirate, then surely he must live like one. If he swung a sword with reckless glee, surely he must fight with the same abandon off-screen. The gossip columns only amplified this illusion, planting stories that painted him as a man who drank hard, fought harder, and loved recklessly. The truth, however, was more complicated. Flynn's early life wasn't glamorous, it was chaotic. He wasn't a polished aristocrat. He was a boy, abandoned by cold parents, marked by beatings, and dismissed as a failure by teachers. He wasn't a born rogue. He was a lonely, angry youth searching for identity. Even in his memoir, My Wicked, Wicked Ways, Flynn admitted to exaggerating his adventures in New Guinea. Stories of tribal attacks, trials, and gold hunts that may have held grains of truth, but were spun for maximum drama. Still, Hollywood didn't care about accuracy. They cared about image, and box office numbers proved the image was golden. By the time The Adventures of Robin Hood hit theaters in 1938, the PR machine had reached full tilt. Flynn wasn't just an actor, he was the embodiment of reckless charm. Audiences flocked to see him leap from castle walls, duel with panache, and steal kisses with his trademark grin. His off-screen escapades, whether real or imagined, only fueled the fire. But Patrice Wymore, Flynn's third wife, would later insist much of this legend was theater. To her, the man behind the mask was far more complex, sometimes shy, often thoughtful, occasionally broken. She argued that the studios inflated his every weakness until it became part of the brand. A flirtation became a conquest. A drunken night became a scandal. A sharp temper became the spark of a swashbuckler's soul. The image, she claimed, was as manufactured as the technicolor glow that framed him on screen. The first scandal that nearly ended his career also supercharged his legend, inside a courtroom packed with fans. The trial that sold tickets. By the early 1940s, Errol Flynn wasn't just a movie star, he was a cultural phenomenon. Women fainted in theaters at his grin, and men lined up to see him play outlaw heroes who seemed unstoppable. But in late 1942, the fantasy collided with a nightmare. Two teenage girls, Betty Hansen, 17, and Peggy Satterley, 15, accused Hollywood's brightest rogue of unlawful explicit conduct with a minor. Almost overnight, the dashing Robin Hood was dragged from the silver screen to the front page, where headlines dripped with scandal. The charges were explosive. Hansen claimed Flynn lured her to a party in Beverly Hills, took her upstairs, and assaulted her. Satterley alleged she had been attacked aboard his yacht, the Sirocco, months earlier. The Los Angeles District Attorney moved fast, indicting Flynn on 3 counts. But the court case quickly morphed into more than just a trial. It became a spectacle, a battle of image versus accusation. The press swarmed the courthouse, fans camped outside, and police had to set up barricades to keep order. Every hearing felt like a premiere. Flynn's defense team was led by Jerry Giesler, a master of showmanship. Giesler's strategy wasn't just to question the girls' stories, it was to turn the entire trial into theater. He brought in the actual bedroom door from Hansen's account, arguing there was no working lock, therefore her story couldn't hold. He cross-examined Satterley on small inconsistencies, including her claim of seeing the moon through a porthole, a claim Giesler demolished with nautical charts, proving no such view was possible that night. He painted both girls as unreliable, inexperienced, and, most controversially, already tainted by prior encounters with men. And the courtroom gasped at his closing act. Giesler, tall and commanding, mocked one of the girls' voices during his summation, mimicking her tone to highlight contradictions. To modern ears, it sounds cruel. In 1943, it played as a devastating theater. The press ate it up. Flynn, for his part, played his role to perfection. He took the stand with calm poise, never raising his voice, never cracking under cross-examination. He admitted to knowing the girls, but denied the accusations outright. He looked the jury in the eye, smiled when appropriate, and charmed the room. Crucially, 9 of the 12 jurors were women. They weren't looking at Captain Blood. They were looking at a man who, in that moment, seemed dignified, even wounded. The judge sealed the victory. He instructed the jury that birth certificates were not always reliable proof of age, implying Flynn himself could have been misled. It was the nudge the defense needed. After 24 hours of deliberation, the verdict came back. Not guilty on all counts. Fans erupted outside, screaming, crying, and chanting his name. Women in the gallery fainted. For the public, it wasn't just a verdict, it was a coronation. But here's the paradox. The acquittal didn't cleanse his image. It cemented it. Almost immediately, the phrase, "in like Flynn," entered American slang. What should have been a scar became a slogan. Flynn leaned into it too, later brushing off his reputation with roguish lines that read, "Today more like evasion than wit." For Hollywood, the scandal was proof of concept. Even courtrooms could be box office machines. Years later, Patrice Wymore would frame the trial as a critical turning point. She said the press and the studio both blurred the line between Flynn's life and his characters, fusing prurient detail with Hollywood myth-making. His acquittal became a marketing tool. The scandal that should have destroyed him instead made him more bankable. The public didn't separate the man from the myth, and perhaps never could again. Of course, acquittal doesn't equal innocence, just as gossip doesn't equal guilt. The truth sits in an uneasy space history can't fully resolve. What we do know is that Flynn's market value soared. The trial made him untouchable in a way no film role ever could. It proved that the scandal wasn't just survivable, it was profitable. The body that swung from rigging and leaped through windows was quietly failing, and it began failing early. A hero's collapsing body. On the screen, Errol Flynn looked untouchable. Cloaked in Technicolor, he was Robin Hood, the pirate king, the eternal rogue who leapt from battlements with laughter in his eyes. But once the cameras cut, a different story played out. The body that audiences worshipped was already beginning to betray him. Behind the swordplay and romantic clinches, Flynn was fighting a battle he could never win. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Flynn never put on a uniform in World War II. Clark Gable, Jimmy Stewart, Tyrone Power. They all enlisted, serving with distinction. Flynn, meanwhile, stayed in Hollywood. The whispers were immediate. Was he a coward? A shirker? Or worse, protected by the studio? Critics and fans alike accused him of dodging duty at the exact moment America demanded sacrifice. The irony was cruel. Warner Brothers' most famous action hero, the man who stormed castles on screen, was declared unfit for combat in real life. The truth was uglier than cowardice. Medical records revealed what the gossip did not. Flynn's body was already breaking. A chronic heart condition, likely undiagnosed for years, made strenuous service dangerous. Malaria, contracted during his wild days in New Guinea, flared up unpredictably, sapping his strength. Tuberculosis lingered in his lungs. Recurrent pain from injuries, some self-inflicted, some from stunts, made even ordinary days difficult. He wasn't avoiding the fight. His body had already lost it. But the disconnect fueled suspicion. Audiences who saw him leap across screens couldn't believe the same man was too sick to serve. In a way, Flynn was trapped by his own myth. If he looked immortal on film, then any weakness off-screen had to be weakness of character. The press sharpened their knives. The man who played Robin Hood was accused of hiding behind excuses. Flynn himself, wounded by the insinuations, wrapped himself in bravado, joking about his ailments while drinking harder to mask them. And the drinking was merciless. What began as a way to ease pain became a ritual, then a dependency. Crew members described his ingenuity, injecting vodka into oranges so he could eat his liquor on set, bypassing restrictions. By the mid-1940s, alcohol wasn't just a crutch. It was a constant companion. When the pain worsened, he turned to morphine. Relief came in syringes and bottles, not doctors. His body swelled, his skin yellowed, and tremors made his once sure movements shaky. By the time he was in his early 40s, colleagues said he looked closer to 60. Friends were alarmed. Director Raoul Walsh, who had guided Flynn through some of his most famous roles, admitted later that Flynn was a dying man long before anyone wanted to believe it. Even on sets, the evidence was clear. He would collapse mid-scene, be rushed off to recover, then stagger back in front of the camera. His voice deepened, his face thickened, his swagger slowed. The audiences noticed, too. The boyish rogue was vanishing, replaced by a haunted figure. And yet, strangely, this collapse unlocked something new. Stripped of youthful shine, Flynn began accepting roles that mirrored his battered reality. In The Sun Also Rises, 1957, he played Mike Campbell, a charming but ruined drunk, a man cracking under debt and despair. Critics were startled. This wasn't just performance, it was confession. In Too Much, Too Soon, 1958, he portrayed his old friend John Barrymore, another genius destroyed by addiction. Again, the line between role and reality blurred until it was painful to watch. For the first time, audiences glimpsed not just the rogue, but the wreckage behind the smile. Patrice Wymore, his third wife, later emphasized this duality. The world saw a carousing drunk. She saw a man who could be thoughtful, polite, even shy, an exhausted soul hiding beneath bravado. He was forever trying to outrun his pain, forever losing. His films in the late 1950s weren't just acting jobs, they were elegies, roles that let him confess what Hollywood never allowed him to say directly. And wasn't his only shadow. Politics, weaponized by a sensational book, would chase his ghost long after he died. Spy, sympathizer, or smear. 20 years after Errol Flynn's death, a book hit shelves with a claim so scandalous it overshadowed everything else. In 1980, biographer Charles Hyam published Errol Flynn, The Untold Story, and its central allegation was explosive. Flynn, the swashbuckler of the silver screen, had supposedly been a Nazi spy. Overnight, whispers became shouts. Newspaper headlines ran wild. For a public that already knew Flynn as Hollywood's wicked rogue, the charge fit like a puzzle piece. And the man himself, long buried, couldn't defend his name. Hyam built his case on association. Flynn had surrounded himself with colorful, often shady friends. One was Dr. Hermann Urban, an Austrian physician and known Nazi Party member who moved in dubious political circles. Another was Freddie McAvoy, a globe-trotting playboy with ties to fascist sympathizers. To Hyam, these connections weren't coincidences, they were evidence. From them, he leapt to a conclusion. Flynn wasn't just reckless. He was a covert operative feeding information to Hitler's regime. The charge stuck because it played to every trope already attached to Flynn. He was unpredictable, defiant, drawn to danger. The idea of him straddling a double life, Hollywood rogue by day, spy by night, was irresistible. Tabloids amplified the claims, readers devoured them, and suddenly Flynn's legend grew darker still. To many, the Nazi spy label felt like the inevitable climax of his wicked ways. But was it true? Later research suggests otherwise. Scholars and journalists tore into Hyam's work and found gaping holes. Errol Flynn, The Spy Who Never Was, published in the 1990s, dismantled the claim piece by piece. Declassified FBI and OSS files, far from proving espionage, painted Flynn as reckless but not treasonous. Yes, he rubbed shoulders with dubious figures, but no, there was no evidence he passed intelligence or served any Axis agenda. In fact, some records suggested the opposite. Flynn had offered his services to Allied intelligence early in the war. His application was rejected, not for disloyalty, but for poor health. Too many ailments, too many risks. Even more telling, Flynn leaned left in his politics. He supported the Spanish Republic in the 1930s, opposed fascist regimes, and in the 1950s, expressed admiration for Fidel Castro's rebellion against Batista. Far from goose-stepping with fascists, he was often cheering their enemies. Even a UK lawmaker went on record, years later, saying Flynn had likely been used by the Allies more than he had ever aided the Nazis. If anything, his celebrity and international reach made him a tempting asset, not a traitor. But nuance rarely sells books. Hyam's dramatic spin, once published, became almost impossible to erase. That's where Patrice Wymore stepped in. In her 80s, Flynn's widow began addressing the spy rumor directly. Her words weren't fiery defenses of sainthood, they were calm, firm corrections. She admitted Flynn kept questionable company. Hollywood was full of eccentrics, grifters, and opportunists, but she dismissed espionage as pure invention. The FBI had tracked him, she reminded interviewers, and nothing stuck. Her conclusion was clear. Flynn was no saint, but he wasn't a Nazi agent either. Her confirmation mattered because it cut against decades of sensationalism. Wymore didn't sugarcoat the flaws, his drinking, his recklessness, his bad decisions, but she drew a line where the myth had outrun the man. Flynn may have flirted with danger, but he wasn't betraying nations. He was, as she put it, a human being at Hollywood's wildest tables, guilty of bad taste in friends, but not of treason. Still, the idea that Flynn could be both rogue and spy lingered in popular culture, proof that scandal doesn't have to be true to endure. Wymore's late-life rebuttal was an attempt to reclaim her husband's story before gossip cemented it forever. But myth isn't only political. It also lived in love stories, some sweet, some deeply troubling. Love, damage, devotion. For all the gossip about Errol Flynn's lovers, one relationship stood apart, not for scandal, but for its unlikely steadiness. In 1950, on the New Mexico set of Rocky Mountain, Flynn met 23-year-old Patrice Wymore, a Broadway ingenue with rising star potential. He was 41, battered by lawsuits and drink, yet still carried that reckless glimmer Hollywood had built into him. Against expectation, the two fell for each other. That October, they married in France. It wasn't a studio match or a fleeting fling. It was a partnership that carried him through the next hardest decade of his life. Their shared life was a split existence, half Hollywood spectacle, half Caribbean refuge. The Jamaican estate they built together was sprawling. 2,000 acres of coconuts, cattle, and coastline. Torch-lit parties drew the likes of Noel Coward and Ava Gardner, who sipped rum on Flynn's yacht under the stars. Yet behind the glamour, Wymore's role was anything but ornamental. She paused a promising career to run households, balance books, and soothe crises. Flynn himself described her as warm, dignified, a woman who lent him stability he could not find in himself. These were not empty compliments, they were confessions of need. But if Patrice represented steadiness, Flynn's instincts still ran toward chaos. In 1957, he crossed a line that would stain his legacy forever. That year he became involved with Beverly Adland, a dancer barely 16 when he first drew her into his orbit. The relationship, which lasted until his death, is not defensible. It is part of the record, and it reveals the darker corners of his decline. Adland traveled the world with him, introduced as his secretary, even starring in his last film, Cuban Rebel Girls. He was in his late 40s. She was still a child. For Wymore, the liaison was a public humiliation. She never divorced him, never staged a revenge tour, but she was forced to watch the tabloids feast on the sight of her husband parading a teenager by his side. And yet, years later, when asked, she didn't dodge the truth. Flynn, she said, felt real affection for Beverly. It wasn't a passing fling, but a desperate grasp at youth, at comfort, at something he feared he was losing. That didn't excuse it. It only explained the loneliness and decline that made him cling to the illusion of rebirth. Wymore's candor mattered. She didn't varnish the wreckage. She acknowledged it, even as she still defended the man from wilder myths. If Patrice endured humiliation, she also endured heartbreak through their daughter. In 1953, she gave birth to Arnella Roma Flynn, a bright, creative spirit who later modeled in Europe during the 1970s. Arnella grew up with the shadows of fame at her back, but the same destructive patterns followed her. Addiction hollowed her out. In 1998, at only 44 years old, Arnella died of a substance overdose in Kingston. It was the same age her father had been when she was born. The family cycle of charm and self-destruction seemed to have closed on her. For Patrice, it was the cruelest echo. She had survived Flynn, outlived their daughter, and was left to carry not just the grief, but the guardianship of a legacy so warped by myth. She managed the Jamaican estate, ran businesses to keep afloat, and spent her later years speaking, not to glamorize, not to demonize, but to set a record straighter than the fan magazines ever had. She admitted his faults, admitted her pain, but refused to let his story be dictated solely by rumor. To understand why she kept defending him, you have to see how the business built him, and then bled him. Built by Hollywood, built by life. Errol Flynn's rise was meteoric and, for a while, unstoppable. From 1935's Captain Blood through The Charge of the Light Brigade and The Immortal Adventures of Robin Hood, Warner Brothers had a new crown jewel. At first, they used him sparingly, testing if audiences would embrace this unpolished Tasmanian masquerading as an Irish adventurer. But when the box office receipts came roaring back, the studio locked him into a mold and never let him escape. Flynn became the heroic lech, the merry swordsman, the rakish lover, whose off-screen reputation supposedly matched his on-screen swagger. That narrative sold tickets by the millions, but it trapped him. Flynn was cast again and again in variations of the same role. The dashing rogue with a blade in hand and mischief in his eyes. There was no room for subtlety, no room for experimentation. He wasn't allowed to age gracefully into character parts. He was forced to stay forever young, forever reckless. And behind the curtain, Warner's publicity machine kept feeding columnists stories about his wild nights, as if the man himself was just an extension of the script. Flynn wanted to prove he was more than a cloak and sword. But every attempt at stretching was shot down by executives terrified of losing their formula. By the early 1950s, the formula collapsed anyway. Warner Brothers ended their 18-year partnership with Flynn in 1953. The man who had once been the studio's greatest treasure was now seen as liability, too drunk, too bloated, too unpredictable. Flynn tried to go independent, gambling his fortune and reputation on a grand pet project, the story of William Tell. He poured his own money into the film, only to watch financing collapse mid-shoot. The project was abandoned, reels of unfinished footage gathering dust. That single disaster gutted his finances, and the bills didn't stop there. The IRS hunted him relentlessly for unpaid taxes. His first wife, Lily Damita, had won heavy alimony payments that bled him year after year. To make matters worse, a business manager allegedly siphoned off a fortune. Flynn, once flush with millions, found himself broke. Yet he still spent like a star, hosting yacht parties, buying land in Jamaica, living as if the box office receipts would never stop. They had stopped. By 1959, Flynn's financial situation was desperate. His most prized possession, the yacht Zaka, once the symbol of his adventurous image, had become a burden. That year, he sailed north to Vancouver, trying to sell the vessel. He was 50, but he looked decades older. Friends said his body was worn down to the core. The autopsy that followed his sudden death told the truth. His organs resembled those of a man in his 70s. The swashbuckler who had swung from ropes and dueled with swords had been hollowed out by years of abuse. And even in death, the mess continued. Untangling his estate took 14 long years. His land in Jamaica, scattered accounts, and business debts tied up lawyers in knots. Patrice Wymore, left with the remains, turned survivor. She ran the estate, built a wicker furniture business, and managed cattle to keep the land alive. She didn't rewrite the story of Errol Flynn into a saint's hagiography, nor did she let him be remembered solely as a monster. Instead, she became the one who footnoted the truth, that Hollywood had written the loudest chapters of his life, but she was still here to correct the margins. In interviews well into her 80s, Wymore kept repeating that theme. The studios had turned him into a product, a myth, and a commodity. The public had bought the myth, not the man. And she, through grief, humiliation, and survival, had been left to clarify which parts were real. Which leaves one claim, her most provocative, that the biggest lie wasn't about lust or law, but about ideology. What she finally confirmed. By the time Patrice Wymore was 85, she had carried Errol Flynn's shadow longer than she had carried his hand. She had buried him, raised their daughter, lost that daughter, and lived decades beyond the Hollywood storm that once consumed her life. And then, when most widows might have chosen silence, she spoke, not to absolve him, not to canonize him, but to draw a line against the loudest lies. Her first strike was political. Wymore's core claim was simple. Errol Flynn was not the fascist demon late-breaking headlines had painted. In interviews, she repeated that he leaned left. She pointed out his open support for the Spanish Republic during the 1930s, his admiration for Castro's rebellion against Batista before the revolution curdled, and even his attempts, rebuffed for medical reasons, to aid Allied intelligence during World War II. To call him a Nazi spy, she said, was not just wrong, it was backwards. Naive? Absolutely. Ego-driven? Without doubt. But treasonous? Never. Her second strike cut closer to Hollywood itself. She confirmed what many historians had long suspected. The studio had inflated Flynn's flaws until they became the very product they were selling. Publicists leaked tales of wild affairs to gossip columnists. Columnists spun those whispers into headlines. And the box office rang. Even the trial, the ugliest, most humiliating chapter of his life, wasn't treated by Warner Brothers as a catastrophe, but as an opportunity to keep him hot, to keep him dangerous, to keep him bankable. Flynn wasn't born a monster. He was marketed into one. Wymore's words didn't erase the damage. They didn't erase the victims. But they reframed the story. Hollywood had packaged his chaos, then sold it back to the public as entertainment. And then there was the guarded secret. Wymore hinted, never proved, that somewhere in sealed files were traces of Flynn's wartime offers to help Allied intelligence. He wanted to serve, she suggested, but was rejected because of his failing health. Without documents, it remained in the gray, more rumor than revelation. Still, she returned to the theme again and again. Flynn had been misunderstood, miscast even in history. He was complicated, not covert. Damaged, not demonic. Her testimony did not excuse him. She never tried to pretend he hadn't hurt people, or that his relationship with Beverly Adland was anything but destructive. What she did was recalibrate. She asked audiences to distinguish between the man who drank himself into ruin and the Nazi spy caricature invented by opportunistic biographers, between the lover who failed her and the cardboard womanizer scripted by publicists, between the actor who delivered brilliance in Robin Hood and The Sun Also Rises, and the cartoon rogue immortalized in gossip columns. If there is a truth that could have changed history, it isn't that Errol Flynn secretly worked for the Allies. It's that scandal itself, fed by studios, swallowed by tabloids, demanded by fans, can rewrite a life more completely than any script. The legend of Flynn has always been louder than the man. What Wymore confirmed at last was that much of that legend was theater. Her last word matters because it isn't absolution. It is calibration. She refused to let him be remembered as a saint. She refused to let him be remembered as a spy. She insisted on the messy, uncomfortable middle, the man who was both dazzling and broken, loved and feared, reckless and human. And in a world that prefers myths to nuance, that may be the boldest defense of all. If you want more deep-dive breakdowns that separate studio spin from real lives, like this video, drop a like, hit subscribe, and tell us which Golden Age icon we should cover next. And when you're done, watch the video on your screen now for another story, where a star's off-screen myth swallowed the truth.